Professor Rebekka and Dr. Sofie.
Good morning, everybody. Live from the cave.
Yes. Today we are going to talk about Gilles' article, The Case for Colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you could say that the article can be summarized with just looking at the title and then the first two sentences, where Gilles talks about that he argues for that colonialism was beneficial for the colonies, and then as well as implementing improved colonize today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, Gilles is talking about colonialism as beneficial for the colonies, but how can you criticize that, Rebekka?
Yeah, so there are, as we all know, various critiques of this article. It's been very controversial. One of the critiques that I found quite interesting is the one made by two economists, Dupas and Rueda. And one of their arguments against Gilles is that the way he uses a cost-benefit analysis is not the right way, or it's not really valid. So what they say is that when you use a cost-benefit analysis, then you can look at obviously the benefits, for instance, of a certain development. So if we say a benefit of colonialism, or development of stemming from colonialism, but what you cannot do is you cannot compare it to how would this development have been without colonialism. So the comparison between a country that has been colonized and the same country that hasn't been colonized it's not possible to make it. So in that sense, the way Gilles uses it is not valid. It doesn't make sense. Yeah. So there's no evidence for what he's saying when he uses the cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, just imagine doing it. Just imagine comparing, for instance, Egypt and then United Kingdom, and how the economy developed in a country that had lots of factories and a country that didn't. I mean, it's just, of course there's differences, and of course if you would compare it, the result would be very different.
So that's the thing. You can only compare then the colonized country to a not colonized country. So instead of comparing the country to itself, like in the case of being colonized and not colonized. So what you just said, comparing development or economic development in Egypt to economic development in the UK.
Yeah. Or at least that they're saying that's not been done, and that's not how you normally do it, and that's while looking at it and talking about all these economic benefits, that's just looking at it in a very, very specific way, and not taking everything in consideration.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
And then they also make the argument that he doesn't include the long-term impact as well. You've been talking a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But you had a really good example of how we can see that using Iraq. Yeah.
So that's it's related. This case is related to long-term impact. But for me, this is a personal critique of Gilles, is how if you only look at cost-benefit analysis, then there are certain things that you cannot measure. So what I want to emphasize in the case of Iraq, and looking at how legacies of colonialism or the British mandate in Iraq is still present today or still impacting the country today, is looking at politics of identity. So looking at the population of Iraq, we have several both ethnic and religious groups. And what has been a legacy of the British mandate is that all of these different groups have been governed from Baghdad. So and besides that, it's been the Sunni minority of the country, the Sunni Arab minority, who has been in power. So this issue of identity politics and sectarian conflicts stemming from how the Brits chose to make like the government, or like the way that the country was ruled, is still present today. And we see, like, even though, I mean, the country has been independent since 1932, like officially, but as a lot of Iraqis say, 1958, because that was when the monarchy was terminated. But still today we see like how this legacy of a minority rule and having so many different groups being governed from like a central capital is impacting the country in like very negative ways.
Yeah, and this negative way and the groupings you can also see if you look at, for instance, Lebanon or Israel-Palestine. That would also be other examples of doing it.
Yeah, so sick.
And some people say that this, if you look at this and if you look at these groupings, you could also talk about colonialism today, that is even existing today. It's arguable, but you can talk about it how, like today we also see external factors or external partners going and supporting a specific group in one of these countries in the Middle East, and how that's also problematic for if you want to shape just one united identity. It's problematic just supporting one group. Yeah. So in that way you can argue we still have colonialism today, but it is questionable.
But it's an interesting discussion, and I think the issue, like just going back for a second to Gil's article, is if you only do cost-benefit analysis, then there are so many things that you cannot look at, and if you're not concerned with the long-term impact, then you're also like missing a lot of very important issues related to colonialism. So but it's a very interesting debate whether we can whether it's possible to argue that there still exists like forms of colonialism. I may be able to argue that I've myself been a part of it, being deployed as a part of an international coalition in a mission in Iraq, where so a lot of international forces can impact the country. I think there's also another example that Kendhammer mentions, like other examples of that's an article that's not in the readings, but which was recommended. So he also has several points concerning like more like newer forms of colonialism, or
I'm not sure if he talks about colonialism specifically, but he talks about how like looking at Gilles' text, he actually makes some valued points critiquing the post-colonial studies and like saying that they're not perfect, but he basically just criticizes again Gilles' methodology. So you can point out that, and Ken Hammer doesn't do that. He just say that there is part of the article that's valued, but he just doesn't elaborate on these points, and then that's a problem. But if you look at the Gilles text, what you could say is that when you talk about aid, for instance, or you talk about what you just said,
identity politics and so on.
Identity politics, but also military interventions or military presence in the countries, but also human rights, then we can see that there's still problems today of foreign countries going into the country, but also the whole collaborating on a global level. It's still a problem today, which could be connected to colonialism. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. But then an interesting point, I think, is also with Ken Hammer, that using him, you could also point at Gilles' point about freedom fighters, glorification about freedom fighters.
These anti-colonial movements and the leaders of these movements, right? Yeah.
And how he uses specifically the Kenyan example, the Mau Mau, and how these freedoms fighters came into power after the decolonization. And actually today you can see that it's still the clan that got the power after the independence in Kenya is still the one in power today. They just had election, and then it was the grandson of the first president.
All right.
That I think it's a grandson, or is it the grand-grandson?
Okay.
It's still within the family.
But he gained the presidency again.
Yeah. And you still have this glorification of the first president, but that's very problematic. Like it sometimes can be seen as problematic to, for instance, the glorification of Nasser, but also looking at Iraq.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at the previous presidents of Saddam Hussein, you like in most Western countries, people would see him as an awful dictator. But if you like among Arabs, there's actually a lot of people who like glorify him and see him as a hero. Like they would have him, hanging on the wall. You would have like different icons of freedom fighters. I've like seen this myself at in a home in Palestine. How we had like who was it? Che Guevara and Gamal Abdel Nasser, and then Saddam Hussein, like hanging next to each other because they were like they were icons and
heroes.
Yeah, heroes, of course, and. Considering like colonialism in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein was also seen as somebody who really like opposed Western influence and opposed imperialism in his country, and I think like for that he's he's like very among like not all Arabs like agree with this, but like some people do actually see him as really like a national hero somehow, or like an Arab national hero.
Yeah. So to sum up, Gilly makes some valued points about that you can't criticize post-colonial studies, but because he doesn't elaborate on them, then the analysis is very problematic and not that useful.
And so his use of the cost-benefit analysis is like according to the two economists, Dupas and Rueda, is like he basically uses it in a wrong way. And also as we talked about or discussed, how there are certain things that you cannot measure. So in that sense, an economic approach to examining like legacies of colonialism is not necessarily sufficient, and it can be hard. Like he misses some of these like long-term impacts of imperialism,
and he also,
colonialism.
And he also just basically just handpicks what he wants to focus on and then what he doesn't want to, and you cannot do that. You have to take into consideration like the whole picture of it. Cool.
Any final comments?
No.
Good.